If I just take a step back, just so we can understand the full system, what's the chain of events that leads to this climate change? Like, what's the underlying theory here?
Like what got us here, right?
Exactly.
Like why are we
Yeah.
here in the first place? Uh, so it's our doing, to put it very simply. You, me, and all the other like billion people on this planet, and the other billion who've lived for the last 100 years have brought this about, right? If we just look at it, maybe, over the last 100 years, what has happened? Because the impacts is something that maybe we've seen over the last 60, 70 years, right? So what happened is, 20th century beginning industrialization, right? So started, of course, in the previous century, but we had a lot of industrialization, which means, a lot of industry, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of factories, right? And initially, of course, we had all of this was driven by coal, right? And we started expanding all of this manufacturing, and coal was kind of driving this, right? The industrial revolution was what has driven growth in the 20th century, right? It's the wonder of the 20th century, so to say.
Driven economic growth.
Yes, of course, right? As in growth.
Right.
Then what also started happening is then we discovered fossil fuel, of course, previously, but fossil fuel, we discovered more and more sources of fossil fuel, and we discovered more and more things you could do with it, right? And then we also found more and more ways to kind of use it, right? So you had a lot more cars, you had a lot more shipping, with all of this happening, all of this is basically human activity. A lot of human activity is eventually driven by energy. A lot of this energy was basically coming from either coal or oil or natural gas, petroleum, some form of fossil fuel, right? And how does fossil fuel give us energy? What do? We burn it, right? And what happens when you burn any of the fossil fuel, right? You're burning carbon, because all this is carbon, right? And when you burn carbon, you get carbon dioxide. So we were basically emitting out a lot of this carbon dioxide, which was going into the atmosphere. And so over the years, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased significantly. So to just give you some scale, it has basically gone from about 280 ppm, that's parts per million, pre 1950s, to 420 parts per million right now, right? It's a staggering increase, right? And what carbon dioxide does is carbon dioxide, does something called the greenhouse effect. So the simplest way to understand it is that it forms a blanket around the earth. The thickness of this blanket depends upon the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
So we now have a thicker blanket.
Yes.
420 ppm thick.
Yeah, so you have a thicker blanket, which means that the earth is going to feel warmer, right? And the blanket is becoming so thick that the warmth is not comfortable anymore, right? So that's basically, what started happening. Just to be clear, carbon dioxide is not the only gas that does this. There's a few other gases which are all called together greenhouse gases. The ones you'll hear about most often are methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorocarbons. So all of them do the same effect, but carbon dioxide is by far the largest contributor to this effect, right? And these gases together started, with the greenhouse effect warming up the earth, and that's kind of what has gotten the temperatures to increase, right? Basically, we started measuring how much have the temperatures deviated, because the temperatures will change year on year, right? One year is slightly hotter, 1 year is slightly lower, that's fine. But what we started seeing is that the average started changing a lot. So like this decade is, a lot hotter than the previous decade, and it's much, much hotter than what it was 100 years back. So the baseline we take is what we call the pre-industrial average, which is the average of the 1850 to 1900 temperatures, and we now calculate how much we are deviating from there, right? 2000 to 2010 was on an average about 0.7 to 0.8 degrees higher, but 2023, the single year, just 1 year, was almost 1.4 degrees higher compared to the 1850 to 1900 average, and that's the